Before I begin, I'd like to thank my advisors, which is Dr. Ian George from the physics department and Sally Shivnan from the English department. They've been a lot of good help and doing a great job with putting up with me and giving me lots of good feedback on my project. And then also Mr. McAlpine has been a great help too. Alright, my project is demonstrating science writing through articles on the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident. Now, who remembers the Fukushima nuclear accident? It happened all the way in 2011. Got some hands? Alright, for the few people, you all are well informed. For the few people that don't remember it, it was when a 9.0 magnitude earthquake hit Japan, causing an almost 14-meter giant tsunami to crash into Japan's northeast coast. And that actually triggered a multiple meltdowns in a plant located on the coast that released a whole bunch of radiation that had to evacuate the area immediately around the plant for 20 kilometers, and even beyond that you had 70,000 people who still had their homes contaminated, but they had nowhere to go, and that was outside the evacuation area. And here is before and after of the plant when it was just getting started with the explosion, so you see the smoke coming from the reactors. And there were 4 reactors within this plant that, well, all 4 exploded, but 3 only had a meltdown. So for this plant there's a lot of negative reactions from the Japanese people. And a lot of famous people came forth because Japan, which was originally on track to trying to increase their nuclear productivity so they could get more energy independent, wanted to immediately start cutting back on their nuclear energy. So a famous filmmaker, Hayao Miyazaki, said that they should stop using nuclear plants because it's an old system that they can't control. And even the former prime minister said no nuclear power is the safest nuclear power. And most of these were fear-driven because a lot of journalistic articles were focusing on the death. A lot of them were not focusing on the technical situation behind what caused Fukushima. Hayao Miyazaki was absolutely right when he said it was an old system. The plant was designed in 1970 and hadn't been updated since. The Tokyo Electric Power Company in charge of the plant was trying to cut costs, so they knew that there were potential for disaster. They had a seawall surrounding the plant. They were told it was too small. They didn't raise it. They were told that there were some equipment prone to failure in 1990 by our safety agency, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They still didn't update it. So that we can't control isn't not necessarily true. So that's where my major comes in, science writing. Science writing is trying to explain the science behind a current event or problem to the public. For my project, I tried to teach 3 scientific concepts through 2 different articles. One, a general article, which would be styled as a newspaper article, and another, a journal article, which is not more technical, but more like Scientific American, so it's a more detailed article, but still geared towards a general audience that do not have a physics or engineering major. So they would be the people who need to know the information to be able to make an informed decision on whether or not should they say yay or nay to nuclear power. The project was, skipped a slide, but the project covered 3 main topics. The workings of boiling water reactor, which was the type of reactor in the Fukushima. Nuclear fission, which is how they heat up water to turn a turbine to create energy within a nuclear power. And then radiation, which goes into depth more into the journal article than the newspaper article. And then afterwards, for my project, I had a reflection paper, which is what challenges or issues did I face while trying to write these 2 different articles. The disciplines used is mainly journalism and physics. Physics is obviously to explain how the reactor works, whereas journalism is the template is how you explain the reactor works. That's why you need an interdisciplinary approach, because you can't really just list all the technical details, which is one of the problems I face, because overwhelming your audience makes them get bored and want to put down the article. You need to take a journalistic approach, which is have a story and have a way to present the article that keeps the audience interested so they can still get the information, but they'll read it all the way through. And then when I talked about radiation, I found 2 other disciplines were needed, which was health and environmental science, because you can't talk about the effects of radiation with talking about how they affected the people or their environment around you. And then the bridging strategies I used were reasoning through analogies and multi-causal explanation. The reasoning through analogies was basically for when I was using journalism to convey physics concepts. One of my favorite analogies for talking about nuclear power was describing it like a commercial airline. Commercial airlines are needed. We need to be able to fly overseas or get places, considering how interconnected the world is. But it also has a danger and risk involved in it. And though commercial airlines have a lower risk factor than cars, when a commercial airline crashes, you hear about it worldwide, and there's usually some sort of death toll that is all at once, which is horrible to hear and usually shocking to the public, but we still do not stop flying. We continue to fly. So with nuclear energy, it's a lot of the same thing. Is car crashes, sorry, that was another analogy. With coal still has some bad health effects. You have the carbon dioxide effect. The miners get a lot of health exposure, but it's all over a long period of time before you see any effects of that, so it seems more safe. Whereas nuclear energy, when something goes wrong, it goes wrong badly and it goes wrong really fast, and it's a huge calamity all at once. But we still might need it because fossil fuel is running out. And you need to know when you face something is, in the airline crash, was it a faulty plane or a bad pilot, to help you make a decision on whether you say yes or no to flying. And then physics intertwined with health and environmental science. It was part of the multi-causal explanation when I started to tackle radiation. Overall, I faced several challenges with writing this paper. One of them was when I did a lot of my research is the journalistic articles that I did find already existing on the Fukushima incident did not really go into why the incident happened. Many people know is the tsunami triggered the incident, but who here can tell me the exact technical reason why the plant had the meltdown? It was essentially a blackout, which is pretty simple. When you think about it, it's a simple problem caused a lot of trouble. Is the main power was kicked out by the earthquake, and the tsunami flooded the emergency generators, and they shorted out. So the cooling systems failed, the instrumentation failed, they had no clue what was going on. It was essentially back away and try to clear out, and there's no way to get any portable energy sources back into the plant. And it caused 3 meltdowns of multiple hydrogen explosions, and even there were 6 reactors and 2 thankfully were shut off, but in the 4th reactor it had been defueled, but in the fuel pool below the reactor it still had a fire, because it takes a while for nuclear fuel rods to cool down. There is no easy off button. And then also is trying to get my articles unbiased, because I'm trying to present technical information so an audience can make an opinion. That was very difficult. I had 3 interviews with my articles, and they were all by Nuclear Regulatory Commission employees, and so these are people who are pro-nuclear. And when you have a journalistic article, when you tell a story, it's hard to not have a certain light get attached to that story. So my articles themselves are more pro-nuclear than they are anti-nuclear, which is a bit of a bias that I have to acknowledge is there when people read it, because I do not want to try to influence the readers. But I needed the interviews to tell the story and get the readers hooked in. And then also the biggest challenge, like I mentioned before, was the technical information, is trying to combine the 2 disciplines. It's learning when to pull back on the physics and let the journalism guide the way to the end of the story in your information. Thank you. Well, I either did something really good or something really bad.
Well, let's start off by asking you to reflect on a talk that we just heard before, suggesting question, objectivity in writing.
Yeah.
And you're saying, there you were, identifying biases in your own journalism.
Yeah, I tried to keep it unbiased, but I did not have interviews from both an anti-nuclear expert or or someone who was anti-nuclear. I only really had it for people who were pro-nuclear, and not necessarily I seek them out because they're pro-nuclear. Is within the articles is the 3 NRC employees I contacted were all 3 people involved with the incident. One man was sent over as a representative of the United States to help Japanese experts and give advice. Another man was wrote for the United States, wrote a lessons learned report, which is he investigated could Fukushima happen in the United States, because the Fukushima plant was actually based off of a General Electric American design, so that had to be investigated. And then the third man was in the operations center, which was the NRC headquarters, which were communicating back and forth with the people we sent over in the Japan. So they were all deeply involved, and they knew what was going on with the situation, but these are all people, you have to remember, are pro-nuclear, and that did get reflected in my writing.
So within physics, there's a paradigm of work until you get quantum stuff about being the objective observer. When you learn journalism, are you also taught that it is about being unbiased, and you can identify whether you're being unbiased?
It depends on the type of journalism. There is your straight story, which is conveying this event happened, whereas these stories, because I used the interviews, took on a feature writing approach, which is more of softer news. They call it softer news writing, just because you're presenting a story, you're presenting someone to follow and bring you through in quotes that you try to get to know. And so normally with like politics, what you see on the front page of the New York Times, yeah, you want to try to keep it objective, but the journalistic approach I took added the bias, because I did use the interviews very heavily.
And sorry, just to try and help you, I didn't quite manage to get it out, but when Shane tells us work a feminist perspective would say, identify my facts, is that what you're saying you did, or are you just saying you acknowledged it was there and you felt that it was self-evident? I'm
acknowledging it was there. I wasn't trying to put it in, but it happened anyway. And I thought even though the bias made the story actually kind of good, because I was reflecting the people within the story, but I still have to acknowledge it is there, altering how the reader used the information.
I wonder if you had any particular techniques that you either knew at the outset and employed them in writing this, or learned through the process for making that complex translation from the complex science to a level that sort of an informed layperson maybe could absorb.
I learned through the process.
So what did you learn?
I sent drafts to my advisors, and I first had way too technical drafts, where it was too much of hard information that was kind of difficult to read in, and I knew. And the most difficult part of this was actually learning to pull back until I felt like I pulled back too much, but it's actually, I think I did a right balance, because you gotta take a lot of the extra details away so you can just see the big picture and the big concept, because people don't need to know like the pressure in the reactor or the exact water path that it exact path that the water travels within the reactor, which I did have, and so I had to take out. So it was a learn as you go. And I had some of the interviews, but I wasn't necessarily using them, so it was kind of I was reminded by my advisors to go back to what I learned and to employ these techniques.
So you might want to share with the audience, because I've had an inside view of this, sort of the Joe O'Hara example. So does your audience today understand, like if you were to submit these 2 articles, one would go to a publication like what, and then the more science-oriented one would go towards a publication like what? And how is your approach different with those 2 articles?
My for one of the articles was the newspaper would go to a publication like the feature section in the New York Times. It's a newspaper article. So it could reach a wide range of people who just happened to browse through a newspaper. And Joe O'Hara was the guy who was in the operations center who actually received the call in the U.S. that something was happening in Japan and it's affecting a California nuclear plant. This is a problem. Inform everybody. So he sent out the mass email letting all the supervisors and managers and the NRC know, and eventually activated an operations center, which the NRC has, which can hold 72 people, and it's 24 hours a day, and they use it to run computer models. They have TVs silently in the background to observe a situation. So it's how they approach when there's an emergency situation, and then they send people out and communicate back and forth. So I followed Joe within this operations center, and actually he, as an operations officer, received many phone calls from the public, and using the stories of the calls that he got from the public, I used to to frame the story and introduce the information, but it was more of, I was following a story of this guy who Fukushima happened, all this happened afterwards, trying to create some action within the story. Whereas the other is more of a scientific American article, and so it's for someone who will go and look for it. It's not necessarily presented to the general reader. And I had two people in there, which was Jim Lentz and Charlie Miller, and they were more there for experts and support for getting the ideas in there, and also giving support on this is why it happened. So it wasn't necessarily about following a story between those two, though Dr. Miller had a little bit of a story.
How did the headlines differ? The titles of the two pieces?
The first one's Don't Be Left in the Dark, which it was a power outage, and I thought it was clever. So the main goal of that is just informing the audience on the problem behind Fukushima. And then the other one actually asked a question, which was, could Fukushima happen on American soil? So throughout the article, as I investigated that question, while also investigating the information. And there's a low chance in America, so that should make people feel better. Or a lower chance.
Yeah, quickly. Were you able to hear Mark Hertzgar's talk hot this past fall? If not, even Janet McGlynn might be able to get you access to the film or to the video, because he gave, in my opinion, the best argument against use of nuclear energy I have ever heard. And so you might want to look at that. It was really quite good. And not to put you on the spot, and if you want to pass on this, please do, but we have somebody here, Yoko Tanaka back there. Do you have any particular insights, given that you just come back from Japan? And maybe your own research is something really different than some of that. But I just want to give you the opportunity to say anything that you might want to say, given possible.
My grandparents lived in northern part of Japan, and just he said it was a great earthquake, and she was so scared.
Well, thank you very much. That gives us just